with Dr. Paul Denai and Dr. Sky Michael Johnston. So I'm going to introduce them both, and then Dr. Denai, I'll give you the go ahead to go, and then you can just go and respond afterwards. Reverend Dr. Paul Denai directs the Center of World Christian Studies, a joint venture between North Theological Seminary and Serve Globally, the world missions arm of the Evangelical Covenant Church. Along with his teaching as the professor of missiology and intercultural studies at NPTS, he is also involved in the training of new and returning ECC global personnel. Prior to joining the NPTS faculty in 2005, Paul and his wife Gretchen served as global personnel with the ECC in Thailand from 1987, where he worked in community development, integrating agriculture, ministry to the HIV positive, and church leadership training. He was ordained to Word and Sacrament by the ECC in 1991. Personal interests include organic gardening, vermicomposting, restoration of alley treasures, which is true. I have been the benefit of those. I've benefited from those, and learning how God is at work in the diverse cultural and religious context of the world. He has 4 grown children and a new grandson. Congratulations, Grandpa.
Thank you.
And I am going to introduce Dr. Sky Michael Johnston, who is an assistant professor of history at Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights, Illinois. He earned his PhD in history from the University of California, San Diego in 2019, and has previously taught at the University of Tübingen and Wheaton College. His research focuses on Christian perceptions of the natural world in the early modern period, has been published in the academic journals Environmental History, Renaissance Quarterly, and the Journal of Jesuit Studies. Thank you for being here, and let's give a round of applause.
Thank you for the organizers, especially for Dr. Clayton and your work getting us all here and doing it together and prodding us on to good works and getting papers in on time. I appreciate this topic very much. It's very personal to me. I did not ever call myself somebody who was a missionary in environmental care or creation care. We didn't talk about that. But when I look back now, I realize that's exactly what was happening in that time. I feel like my paper is a corrective on missiology and theology that should lead us to better praxis. And I hope that is the goal of every one of our papers and presentations, is that we would begin with some foundational correctives. And I want to start with this Old Testament passage, which is there in your paper. I won't quote the whole thing, but this last verse I think is very important. And you think about the children of Israel on the threshold of going into the promised land. The promised land, as they knew, was a place that was flourishing, that was milk and honey. There were vineyards, there were orchards, there were lands there that were very fertile. And God made this promise and prediction that when they came into the land, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build your fine houses and settle down, when your herds and your flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God. This was not an idle statement. And I think in our own culture, my own culture, living right now in the Silicon Valley, where there's a lot of flourishing and also a disparity of economic scale, when that silver and gold increases, we forget the Lord our God. And you know, I live in the area where gold was discovered and more money was made on mercury than anything else, right in the Alviso mine, which is about 10 miles from my house. So in my early years as a missionary, I did not recognize how God was at work in some of these places that were what I would call poor, economically deprived. And I remember driving through with one of my colleagues, and we went through this dusty village and came to this place that to me looked like so many other dusty villages, so many places in Thailand, where all I could see for miles was just dry fields and elderly people that were there taking care of grandchildren because the working class had left to make money. And my partner turned to me and said, "This village is ready for Jesus." And I said, "Well, why do you say that?" And he said, "Because no one here has a toilet." And I thought to myself, that's an interesting connection. And sure enough, that was true when I had to find the facility myself. And the tall bushes were where we went. I realized that the good news of God's creation has to reach every aspect of the human condition. And sure enough, with just a little bit of funding, we were able to build very simple septic systems, and there was a community there that still worships the Lord Jesus because they saw Christ coming in, caring for them as a whole person. A septic tank is not usually what we think of as the first place to enter into the good news into people's lives, but it was definitely a place that was necessary in that part of the world. And building latrines is the way I want to talk about starting into this aspect of creation care, because there is nothing that is outside of creation. Anything that we are talking about here, whether it's social, spiritual, or environmental, is part of all of creation. I think that we do a disservice in limiting ourselves to one definition of some of these terms. I believe that God's good news can be summarized as life as God intends it. And I love the passage from Ezekiel chapter 16, where God sees the newborn kicking around in our blood, no one caring for us. Our cord was not cut. We weren't washed or bathed. No one loved us. We were despised. But God came and saw us in our condition. And in that moment says to you, live. And in the Hebrew, it's in there twice. Live, with an exclamation point, if there was one in Hebrew. Live. I want you to live. Even in the book of Acts, it talks about the people who are of the new life. This is what God intends for all of us, is life and flourishing in all of its abundance. And so just to divorce these things into little categories, I think does a disservice to the topic that we're looking at. And when we separate one of those from the other, we fall into several traps. We can worship the creation itself. We can start to think about our own part in God's work as our being part of the social or the spiritual connection, when all of this is God's initiative. And as some of you have already mentioned and we've discussed in our literature, God's mission, I believe, begins with that first act of creation. Whatever that primordial soup was, God brings order into it. And God keeps on doing that over and over again, where we bring chaos and God brings order. We bring chaos, God brings order. And that is the redemptive act in creation care that God continues to pursue us with. So Scripture shows us over and over again how God is so concerned about so many facets of life. There's so much in the Hebrew Scriptures that care about the land, the foreigner and the alien labor workers, the care of animals, the care of the crops. All of these social and environmental concerns are a spiritual concern as well. And Acts 16 tells us about one of the very first early recorded conflicts of the early church, which was an environmental concern about hunger. Are we going to care for everyone equally, or only those that are of our tribe? We see how God has addressed these issues over and over again throughout the whole of Scripture. And when the witnessing community brings those together, the spiritual, the social, and the environmental, there's a positive impact of what the gospel really does and God's reconciling work in the world. Celia Drummond, in her book on eco-theology, talks about the 5 marks of mission. And you can see those written here: proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, teaching, baptizing, nurturing new believers, responding to human need by loving service, seeking to transform unjust structures of society, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the earth. I believe that all of these are part of God's work in the world that God has initiated. God is inviting us to participate. And some of us have one focus of one of these, maybe more than the other, but they cannot be separated as what God's concern is in the world. I also like what Sarah Emmerich writes about when she talks about this 3-dimensional ministry of reconciliation. And we know that we are called as a people of God to be agents of reconciliation. And the threefold agency has to do this with the spiritual, social, environmental. And I quote from Colossians 5 that if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. Let's make sure that we include that in a holistic way. So the fact that with humans, we are still called to be a part of God's ministry and mission, I believe begins with the very first question that God asked in the Bible, which is, what? Where are you? That is the missional question, is it not? That is the initiating God that seeks us and seeks the world and will never stop looking. The parable of the woman who is sweeping and looking for the lost coin is a model of this. God will not stop until the set is complete again. I love the restorative imagery that is in there. God will never stop asking that question, and we should put that question to ourselves each and every day. As God asks us, where are you, Paul Denai? Where are you, North Park Seminary? Where are you in your community? Put your nation in that place. So we're invited to join in this with the work of Christ and the work of the Spirit, the work of the whole Trinity at work in the world, in all of these aspects. So in the last few years, this idea of eco-theology is kind of creeping slowly into mission work. As a missiologist, some people are talking about this a little bit more than they used to. Early on, I remember going to Thailand and people saying, you're not really a missionary. You're raising fish, you're raising pigs. Are you a real missionary? Well, at least I could say something better than my colleague who was a sewage engineer, who was a toilet missionary. But there is a desire there to see God's mission integrated into all aspects of our creation. And I quote some African work there that is now reversing the idea of eco-theology to what he calls where's it? He wants to call it where's my term here? Theocology. Theocology. In other words, let's remember that this is God's initiative. Again, this is the work of God. We put God in front of the ecology part of it. So Howard Snyder, I mentioned, points out to 4 false readings of the natural world. When we make creation more than the creator, we can fall into the romanticizing of nature. And I think that this happens quite often, even in the Christian community, where we believe that nature in its beauty is the primary and profoundest fount of truth. Look at how many of us find truth and connection with the divine in nature itself, but also commodifying nature. And this one goes on all the time, where we presuppose that nature exists for us as a product to be used. This was very much an impetus in missiology and continues today. I'll bring a little bit of that at the end. We worship nature, sometimes deifying the creation itself, and then spiritualizing it, seeing that creation has no other intrinsic value other than some external spiritual truth outside of it. I believe that when we divide those 3 areas, social, spiritual, and environmental, from one another, then we fall into one of these traps of idolatry. So when I say that God is working in this way in the world, I believe that the Trinity is already at work. The work of the Missio Dei starts a long time before any of us show up. Even the missionary. I didn't bring Jesus to Thailand in my luggage. There's God already at work in all of these places. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I hide? You are everywhere. The highest heaven, the deepest place, you are already there. You know me deeply. You know all of us. God's promise is there. And God gives us hope that there is a fulfillment in Christ in all of these places. According to Barna, less than 2 out of 10 evangelicals would say that they would call themselves an environmentalist. And since we know that 95% of missionary work is working with people that are Christians, we've got a very small fraction of people that would say that they are environmentally concerned in the work of God. I think this is a great challenge for us as we think about redefining ministry and mission today. The relationship of creation care to the gospel stems from God's plan for the reconciliation of all things in Christ. All things, meaning not just the human as we've been talking about, but all things. So I don't know if the pigs are in heaven or not, but there are going to be things in creation in the new order in a way that will be redemptive, eternal, and glorifying God. This was part of the attraction for the ministry that my wife and I were involved in for so many years in Thailand. We enjoyed seeing God's work in cultural forms and expressions that changed our own theological perspective, seeing God at work in a culturally Buddhist environment, where there was a sense of a creator, but in pure Buddhism, there is no personifiable God. And yet there was always a calling out to that creator. There were ceremonies that were invoking the spirits of rain, the spirits of land, the spirits of trees and rocks, that there was a spiritual realm there that needed to be addressed. And God was present in the desire to relate to spiritual power. I believe that there's a spiritual quest in each and every one of us that God has implanted, that God's saying, I want to reach out to you. That's part of the Imago Dei in the human, that we have that desire. However, our guest, my respondent, Sky, inspired me to think about how mission has been environmentally impacted by one of his articles. But when environments are so abundant, we often see, like in the chapter in Deuteronomy, that there's a temptation to shift away from that divine authority and to appropriate or expropriate all of these environmental benefits for ourselves, and to not give the glory back to where it should come from. The problem is not with the creation itself. The fact that there is gold in the ground or oil in the soil, or that there is resources that can be used, there's nothing wrong with any of that. But when they become idols, that's when we fall into the temptations. And we fall into this dualistic thinking that the Missio Dei is only one part of this. So when the earth is our Eden, we tend to think that it's there for our use. And this is the history, especially of Western colonial powers in mission. Let's just admit that that is still going on in the world today. So recovering this view of healthy praxis needs to look at these in a balanced way. My home state right now, where I'm living in California, stands an example of a missionized society and a misrepresentation of these three dimensions of reconciliation, especially where I live now, which is now called the Silicon Valley, one time called the Valley of Heart's Delight. It is an illustration of what happens in mission work. Christian missionary activity first began on the North American coast way back at the end of the 17th century, when Juan Maria de Salvatierra first started this first Spanish settlement in what is now Baja California, when it was the Spanish colony of Mexico. And over the next several decades, 13 missions were struggled to work down there. If you've ever been to Baja, you know how dry and the desert climate that was there. And in the words of one of the last Jesuit missionaries there in 1752, found that the area was nothing but stones, symptomatic of the people that were there. That if the environment had been more hospitable, surely the people would have seen the goodness of God and be open to greater spiritual understandings. And the case of the Jesuits raises a really interesting case in mission, where the possibility was that if people fail to alter their environment in a desired way, is God really at work or not? So I want to use the case study here of the northern Alta California mission, as opposed to the Baja story. And in 1773, King Carlos III of Spain ordered the expulsion of all the Jesuits because there was rumors that they had become very wealthy. They had built churches, yes, but there was nothing like the wealth that he imagined. And he replaced all of those Jesuits with Franciscan missionaries. Franciscans, thinking that they would be more charitable, perhaps more frugal and environmentally concerned, but concerned with the people. And they were led by the very ambitious and perhaps infamous Father Junipero Serra, who some of you know about. He arrived at the age of 55, which in 1773 was pretty elderly. We would not send a missionary in that equivalent age today. But where Baja was a desolate climate, Alta California, on the other hand, was a paradise, especially as they moved farther north of Santa Barbara and the first Presidio fort in Monterrey. And they found this valley that was the most abundant that they'd ever seen, which is today we know as the San Francisco Bay Area. And from hearing from a local spokesperson who I've gotten to know, Corina Geary, who is related to the Tamian Nation, the first, those who live in that area originally, she talked about how this area what is considered the San Francisco Bay Area today, at its peak, had the highest diversity and number of distinctly different indigenous cultures and languages of anywhere in the world, only second to Papua New Guinea. And if we could look at, you can't see the names in this map, but this represents over 80 different, very distinct tribes and languages just in that very small area of what we call San Francisco Bay Area today. The flora and the fauna were amazing in this area. And I list all the remains that they have found recently in archaeological digs. They're putting in a new BART station. The remains of shark and rockfish, sardine, number of kinds of birds and mammals. These were all part of the diet. This was all there in this area. Because there was so much environmental abundance there, warfare was very minimal. Although Corina told me that when you picked from the wrong acorn tree, people would go to war about that. Well, there were things that were territorial, but there was so much abundance that people did not have to be nomadic. They lived in their areas. They were not necessarily moving from one area to the other. They were hunters and gatherers. They had all that they needed in the local streams and the marshes and the mountains. So when mission began to reach north from Baja into Alta California, the king of Spain envisioned that the Franciscan mission, unlike what had happened with the Jesuits, would just be temporary. It would be a 10-year plan. Within 10 years, these people would be converted. They would become gente de razón. They would become people of reason. They would become civilized and Hispanized. They would become Spaniards, and then the mission would be turned over to them. As we know, that did not happen. Not one mission of the 21 ever came under Indian control, and very, very few natives were ever given even the smallest parcel of land. However, this was very important in this political environment at the time. Think about the end of the 1700s into the 19th century, when Russia was coming from the north, and then there was a threat of the Americanos coming from the east. This was even before the gold rush. And the Russians had set up Fort Ross just a few miles north of San Francisco, what is today San Francisco, and there was a clash north and south between Roman Catholicism and Russian Orthodoxy. And the native population were caught in the middle. There's a story of Peter of the Aleuts, who was captured by the Catholics and taken down to Monterey for torture and to pressure to convert to the true faith. He was already an Orthodox Christian, and they pressured him to become baptized in the Holy Mother Church of Rome. He was tortured by dismemberment. His fingers were cut off digit by digit, and his feet were cut off until he died of his dismemberment. And at that moment, one of the witnesses was able to share the story, who survived and ran back to the fort. And they said, "Oh, blessed, our first martyr of the Russian Orthodox Church." And his icon is there in Fort Ross today, showing his healed hand, blessing the people with the grace that was given to him. Creation care was not something that was in the language of that day. It was more of these missions were established to provide the fuel and the food for the presidios, the forts of San Francisco, Monterey, and San Diego. The temporalities, I have a quote there, fields of grain and pasture, the adobe churches, all of this were but instruments to free Indian minds to contemplate Jesus. In other words, bring them in from their busy life of gathering and hunting and bring them in to study Jesus. So the Franciscans believed that the only way to accomplish their goal was to break the cycle of Indian life in which hunter-gatherers pursued alternative patterns of ceaseless labor, of food following, by profligate indulgence afterwards. In other words, you can hear the language of that day. The characteristics of Gentile life, the pagan life, in the forest must be expunged in their thinking by neophyte life in the missions, in which Indians would learn a European division of labor and new skills. Well, along with all of this that was happening, of course, livestock was being brought in. The Spaniard soldiers were not going to eat acorns and grizzly bear. They were going to want wheat. They were going to want beef. And so the livestock that was brought in resulted in the disruption of the native landscape, which we have today. The legend is that Guanaparosera, perhaps others, brought in the Brassica nigra, the wild mustard, which now covers the hills of California, is an invasive species. And has an allelopathic tendency, which makes it sort of toxic to growing anything else. That has spread, and that creates the pathway among the El Camino Real, the Royal Road, that lists from the missions from San Francisco all the way to San Diego, and spreading even more. So the legacy environmentally of that early mission is still growing on the hills right there. Along with all of the along the 21 stations of Franciscan mission in Alta California, the number of Indians that were baptized over less than 70 years was some 80,000 out of the original population of over 300,000. So considering all of the massive growth of cattle and the raising of wheat and the civilization that was happening, in many mindsets at the time, this was seen as successful mission. However, as we know, the tragic story, which was unknown at the time, was what they call virgin soil epidemics. When germ theory was unknown, the environmental impact was devastating on the population. So beginning with the 65,000 in the mission zone in 1770, only 17,000 Indians remained by 1830, in a decline of 74%. The Franciscans had no knowledge that the congregation of Indians at their missions, confining them in close quarters and having them work at tasks, would facilitate the spread of disease and contribute to the deaths of those they sought to save or control. If you've been to Mission Santa Clara, the Rose Garden there is the cemetery of the native population that is under this plot of land next to the mission. When the Secularization of Mission Act was imposed by upon the Franciscans after Mexico gained its independence in 1883, all the priests and monks were recalled and the mission system fell into disrepair. There were very few that remained since there was no leadership at that time. And of course, with the discovery of gold, then squatters came in from the east, and we have the land that we have today. All that we have today are the legacies of names of some of the Spanish hacienda families, the Bernal family, the Berriesa family, the Sunol family, the names that are naming all of the cities up and down the coast of California are the impact of what we see. So poverty could be an impact or a place of entree in certain places of mission, but the environment to be an Eden becomes so tempting that the desire to exploit the landscape took over the spiritual concern of people. This was hard, I think, for even missionaries in those days to understand and to think about. Although I know there were voices that were trying to fight against the devastation, but the population of the pressure to Christianize and civilize took over some of those other more spiritual concerns. So one of the signs of God's kingdom coming is when the good news reaches the poor. Isaiah 61 tells us that because there's no other reason that people would be reaching out to the poor. However, it's difficult for the kingdom of God, for the wealthy to enter the kingdom of God. I'm going to end with this quote by Drummond. And she says that arguably eco-theology praxis would not be focused on this last, striving to safeguard the integrity of creation, but would incorporate the ecological insights into all 5 marks of mission, including proclamation of the good news as ecological as well as encompassing humanity. For this reason, the 5th mark of mission should be the first priority rather than the last in its present position, implying incorrectly that ecological practices are an afterthought, having dealt with first the human community. So I end again with the question that I started with, which doesn't show up on this slide here, but the question of God's invitation, even here in the Silicon Valley today, is, where are you? Will you be a part of my mission? So as unlikely as it seems, a person or a place near you may be more ready for Jesus than you think. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Paul Denai. And now we'll have our respondent, Dr. Johnston. Thank you.
Professor Denai for a rich lecture, and I'm honored to have that opportunity to offer a response here in this company. Professor Denai has suggested that we employ a 3-dimensional approach to missions, one that pays attention to not only the spiritual aspect of people's lives, but the social and the environmental aspects as well. I would like to further explore what that might look like today. I think we'd do well to reflect deeply on the categories of scarcity and plenty that Professor Denai has brought to our attention. He read from Deuteronomy chapter 8, which describes a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing. And then in his historical example, he created a fascinating juxtaposition from the history of missionary efforts in 18th century California between the desert landscape of modern-day Baja California and the fertile region around what is now the Bay Area in Northern California. And of course, it's very interesting to me because, as he mentioned, he quoted a reference to an article that I wrote, and I'm also from California myself, so lots of points of connection there. Professor Neui points out that the Jesuit missionaries in Baja California viewed the landscape there as being spiritually and physically sparse, and even as a kind of hell on earth. And the missionaries did see it that way. Franz Inama reported this story about one of his elderly fellow missionaries who had recently died in California, and I quote, "A beautiful child informed him about the time when he would die and that he would enter heaven without passing through purgatory." Inama further explained, God was accepting his suffering here in lieu of that in the next world. So California was literally purgatory on earth for the missionaries, literally. But I personally find the view of 18th century Baja California as a place marked by scarcity and emptiness, much less a hell on earth, to be suspect. I would go so far as to reject that outlook altogether. And I think if we look at the broader historical context, I can make a case for my argument and its significance. If we think historically about Christian missions since the foundation of the Jesuit order in 1540, Christian missions has taken place in a broader context of the European colonization of the world and Western imperialism. The two have been intertangled, as Professor Denoi has also highlighted. For instance, whose ships did the Jesuit missionaries ride on to get to Baja California? The Spanish colonialists. The broader imperial context is also very important for understanding the missionary ideology, or theology, to be more precise, of the Jesuit missionaries in Baja California. Their missional theology went hand in hand with the colonial task of the Spanish soldiers who accompanied them. The missionaries believed the indigenous Californians of the Kikimi, Guacura, and Paracu regions to be simple-minded. The missionaries believed that the Californians first needed to know that they had an earthly king, the Spanish monarch, before they would be capable of understanding that they had a heavenly king as well. This outlook also shaped the environmental efforts of the missionaries. German Jesuit missionary Jakob Begert dreamed about creating a European-style landscape that he could not build in dry California. He wrote, "And if one finds here, as one thinks in Europe, as much rain and as many rivers as there, one could with so much space have more cows and consequently more cheese and butter than in the entire canton of Bern. One also could sow and harvest in abundance." He went on to say that he would like to build a town with, quote, "well-dressed people living together in huts, living on agriculture the way people do in Europe." And he also imagined that these people would be good Christians who practiced religious rituals in the same fashion as Europeans. As it was, the missionaries were unable to build an agricultural settlement that could support themselves, the Spanish troops, and the local populations year-round. So the missionaries could not forcibly hold the Californians at the settlement and force their moral norms upon the local populations. Instead, they had to let the Californians go into the land to get food for parts of the year, during which time the missionaries lamented the Californians were fornicating. But here is the interesting thing. It was not the Californians' lifestyle that proved to be unsustainable. It was the missionaries' ecology that could not survive in Baja California. Indeed, when the Jesuits were expelled from the Spanish Empire, the missions were abandoned. Now, St. Junipero Serra, which is an interesting development in the last couple of years, and the Franciscans replaced the Jesuits and moved north to what is the state of California today in the US. And I had never thought about this. I never thought about this until I was considering this fascinating juxtaposition of the hell on earth, Baja California, and the Eden of the Bay Area. And what stood out to me for the first time was the remarkable leveling effect that was inherent in the colonial European outlook. Whether it was hell or Eden, the plan was the same. Turn it into a settlement with a town, a church, agriculture, and livestock where the lifestyles of local populations can be forcibly controlled. And Sarah was able to successfully do this at his newly founded missions, and he did subjugate the local populations in Northern California. And Professor Denai brings up a remarkable irony in his talk. So he describes how prior to the missionaries arriving with their help that materially did more harm than good, that diverse local populations practiced forest management and with controlled burns and had a diverse diet of plants and animals. But the missionaries, along with the colonizers, determined that the local populations needed to be forcibly subjugated until they demonstrated, and this is maybe only in the manuscript, but Professor Denai says it really well, the marker of when they could hand the land back to the Californians was when they were self-sufficient and capable of managing the land and the livestock. And what irony, right? The local populations were self-sufficient and capable of managing the land and had a diverse diet before the missionaries came. In both cases, in Baja California and Northern California, the missionaries came in with something to build, and they could not see what was already right in front of them. They did not just see Baja California as an empty space, they viewed Eden as an empty space as well, because it did not have the European farms, livestock, and church buildings. And this is the frightening thing. Most of us Americans have largely maintained these missionaries' way of viewing the natural world for centuries. Environmental historian William Cronin opened up Americans' eyes to the glaring problems with this outlook in his landmark book, Changes in the Land, that was published in 1983, just 40 short years ago. Cronin helped us realize that European settlers did not land on a blank ecological canvas. He showed that Native Americans were already changing and manipulating the landscape of North America before Europeans arrived. He writes, "The choice is not between two landscapes, one with and one without a human influence. It is between two human ways of living, two ways of belonging to an ecosystem." And what is the situation today? Now, on a global scale, the world that has been conquered by Western colonial rule and imperialism is facing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, air pollution, and biodiversity loss. Northern California, the Eden, California, is getting burned up by wildfires. All of California is drying out, unless that problem is solved by long-term hurricanes, which we have in the Pacific now. And our desert megacities like Las Vegas and Phoenix are in danger of facing the same fate as the Jesuit agricultural settlements in Baja California. Two ways of living, two ways of belonging to an ecosystem. Is it possible that we have taken the wrong path, and are we willing to change course? How do we know that next time we will be helping and not making things worse? Philosopher Olufemi Otaiwo has warned of the dangers of what he calls climate colonialism. The risk, he suggests, is that our solutions for solving the climate crisis build on the structures created by colonialism and even exacerbate global injustices and inequalities. He points to a solar farm in Morocco that provides energy and profits to Europe rather than to the people whose land is being used. And what about this? Could the environmental component of our three-dimensional approach to missions turn into just the latest example of missionaries coming in with a coercive vision for how other people need to live their lives in relation to the natural world? I am wondering how we can safeguard against environmental missional colonialism, against uncritically exporting our ways of belonging to an ecosystem. Maybe one such safeguard would be to try to heighten our appreciation of what is already here in the world, rather than focusing on what is supposedly missing and what we can build. Is it the case that too often we still see the world as being empty or sparse? Perhaps we are the ones who can humbly learn from our neighbors around the globe how to see plenty where we only see scarcity. I'll close with this quotation from a 2021 sermon by German climate activist Louisa Neubauer. And her sermon's on the passage Matthew 6:25-33, which we've just been talking about, and I think actually complements Dr. Barrow's discussion really well, especially her third point. And of course, this passage contains the famous line, "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them." And Neubauer leaves us with a hopeful reminder of the bounty of God's creation and the possibility that, as God promised in Deuteronomy 8, you will lack nothing. Here's my translation of the passage from Neubauer. The critical message of Matthew for me plays out in a completely different dimension. It is not imperative to collect the great treasures of the world. It is imperative to protect them. It is the planet, the creation, that provides everything we need. We must not worry like the birds truly, because it's all here, provided we are careful with it. You shall not lay up treasures for yourself on earth. If we take precautions, then we don't need to worry about providing for ourselves. The unending diversity of species, plants, and animals is here for us. The soil that could also feed 10 billion people is here if we take care of it. The sun and the wind are here to give us energy if we commit to it. And also for us here is the unbelievable maximum capacity of humans, of people whose hearts are good and who want to do good, if one lets them. It is all here. Thank you.
Thank you both, Dr. Denai and Dr. Johnson, for your rich presentations and responses. And we'll open the floor now for questions. So as a reminder, please come forth and use the microphone so that the folks online can hear you clearly. Questions, they're brewing. Okay, we have one right now.
So I have a comment that hopefully can spur further discussion, but one of the things that I'm wondering about is this narrative of abundance, you know, that everything is already here that we need. And yet people have harvest failures. The rains maybe don't come and the river is too low and there's a drought. Even in times when, thousands of years ago, before all of our ecological climate change problems, right? So how do we live into those realities? And I guess one of the things I'd offer up is, as I've studied a little bit more recently of the ways in which people farmed during biblical times in the biblical lands, is a sense of this long-term sustainability, of looking long-term and not in a subsistence sort of way of living, rather than getting as much out of the land as possible. And that meant that they would save and not just sell all the time, So do you see some of that, the change of mindset, and how do we hold on to this hopeful, abundant view of creation and yet face the realities of the fears and the lack that people really truly face?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start with a comment, then Sky, you can mop up. Okay. I think we need to recognize that we in the United States consume over 1/4 of the world's resources, and yet we are, what is it, 1/50th of the world's population, something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. We in this country are the consumers of a variety of things. So we are the cause of the world's disparity. And when we flood other countries with our economic and agricultural aid, we undercut local sustainability. I know that my friend David Hughesby, who is director of Covenant World Relief in the past, was in the Sudan when he was talking with a farmer who could see the trucks from the US coming in saying, there goes my daughter's tuition right now. She can't go to school. I will not be able to sell my crop because this other donation has just come in for free and nobody will buy from me. So I think we need to recognize the responsibility that each of us have. And we talked about that even a little bit today. Our purchases, our dollar purchases, we vote with our forks, we vote with our votes, we vote with our dollar spending, our flex spending. It's impacting on a ripple effect that we don't recognize because we're so divorced from the source of where our food comes from, or any of our resources, oil and all the rest of it. So I think if we can talk a little bit more in the church about the fact that lifestyle impacts the world's environment, and that there is a theological heresy, I want to say, that those who are wealthy are blessed of the Lord and those that are poor are cursed. I never heard it preached so directly like that, but there's an implicit bias there. And prosperity theology and other things have built onto that. So recognizing that disparity exists and that we are the cause, okay? I want to say that pretty strongly as the U.S. citizen here. We consume so much and we draw so much of the world's resources. And that will not change until we change our own habits and our own lifestyle and our desire to indulge in the now. I'm hopeful that there are movements even to clean up the ocean and to do other things. But as you mentioned earlier, I don't think that science is going to be the salvation because it has not saved us yet. I think it's going to be the groundswell of small voices coming together, native voices. And the largest growing population in the US right now is the native population. 540 natives, national, I'm not sure if that's the exact number, but that was the number that came to me a couple of weeks ago. We have 540 nations within our nation. Those numbers are growing, and there's a resurgence of cultural indigenous knowledge that is being sought after in a new way. So that gives me hope. That's on.
Yeah, well, I think that's very, very well said. I think the important thing to realize is that, yes, people are suffering shortages and climate change is a cause of that a lot. But if we look at this at a broader system, this is why I'm talking about the colonial system that's been built that still shapes who has wealth and who doesn't in the world today. There is enough to go around, so it's not really a natural problem when you look at it at a really large scale. It's a political problem, and that's why I think if we go back to Celia Drummond's 5 points, the fourth point talks about justice. I forget exactly how it was worded, but it's really environmental justice is absolutely vital. Climate justice is absolutely vital to solving these issues, because we could solve the climate crisis, and we might, and exacerbate inequalities at the same time. To give a historical example, so I'm not an expert on sustainable farming, but there's a book by Mike Davis from like 20 years ago called Late Victorian Holocaust that gives the example of the famines that killed millions of people in India when it was colonized by the British. Over the same years that they were exporting enough grain to feed everybody there, because it would have hurt the economy that was centered in London. So that's a historical example that I think is the same thing that Professor Neui is talking about. And you heard in the quote that I read, just to talk about this from a sort of biblical or theological or Christian perspective, you heard Louisa Neubauer quote, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." And when I was reflecting on that sermon, that's what really hit me. I'm just not sure there's anything in the Bible that we American evangelicals neglect more than that the command, "Do not store up treasures on earth." What if we took that seriously as a command? That would probably solve the problems, because why are we mining in the Amazon and destroying the rainforest? for companies to boost their profits. The same with the oil industry. That's the whole history of that. You can look into that. And we've almost been, trained to think that the moral thing for us to do is to accumulate wealth. It's the responsible thing to do. And we just sort of, for people who grew up in white evangelical cultures like I have, inherently think this is the right way for it to be, that probably the car companies and not the workers are on the right side of the strike right now. That's another example of industry going green, and now the electric vehicles will have less parts than the old cars, and so who's going to profit off of that, and who's going to get hurt from that? That's a lot of analysts say, a part of the reason for the strikes right now. So there's a lot of examples like this, but it's record profits. It's record profits for the shareholders. It's storing up treasure on earth. Sometimes it's just that simple. Sometimes I think the messages from the Bible just are right there if we really listen.
Other questions, feedback? Thank you.
Appreciate this session, and appreciate sharing those 5 principles of maybe new mission or however we would categorize those. I think on the one hand, they can chart a new way forward, but I'm wondering about the role of repentance for what has occurred. For those of us who come from those colonial traditions or people or live on land that was taken. I'm wondering what does repentance look like other than just let's do it different now? What do we owe the past and the bearers of the past?
That's a great question. And I think that comes under the number 4, to seek transformation of unjust structures of society, which are historically built, which we benefit from if we are from the white dominant culture. They were made, they're not broken, they were intended to serve the way they're serving. So if we're saying these are unjust structures, they need to be changed. I believe that there is a kind of reparation that can happen. And it happens in context. So this is not something that's just a global conversation and can be utilized everywhere. But I'll give another example from the Bay Area, since I'm familiar with that. There was a 1 mile square Black community in what was now part of Hayward in the East Bay. It's called Russell City. It was its own community because of a variety of redlining rules that did not allow Black people to live elsewhere. They had stores, they had businesses. There was a famous jazz club in the center of it that was very popular with everybody who would come from miles around to go to this jazz club. But at a certain point after World War II, the property on the East Bay became very valuable. Hayward decided they wanted it, and they started to appropriate it. And there were a variety of mysterious fires that moved people out. No one was ever implicated. And finally, after a period of time, all those families were moved out, and it became part of Hayward. In the last 5 years, has been a movement in Hayward to do some restitution, see if there's a way that they could bring reparations back. And they've basically opened it up for conversation, and 21 families that were related to those who lived there have come forward. And the city is looking for ways to build a little bit of financial reparations for that community to remember what was done unjustly. I think there's another aspect to this, though, that is going to take a lot longer than just a payment of a certain kind of fee at a certain time. There's structures that are here which we have to confess that we continue to benefit from if we are part of this dominant narrative. And the injustice of that has to be exposed through dialogue with those who are marginalized by those same systems and hear their stories. It's going to mean building relationships that are going to be very uncomfortable. And it's going to mean a commitment to more than just a one and done trip. There's going to need to be much more of an intentionality, I think, even within our Christian community. But the Christian community, sorry to say this, God is not going to wait for the church to do this. I mean, we think about the environmental movements of the world right now. They are not led by the Christian community. But I know that there are people that are very deeply concerned about these things. And I believe this is part of the Imago Dei created in humans, that we want to see world orders restored. That God's saying, I want to bring order back into your chaos. Will you join me? So the reason that, for example, Monterey Bay, once the most worst sewage of the California coast, is now one of the most pristine environments in 30 years. It's changed from one of the most polluted to one of the most environmentally rich areas, because there's been a coalition of people coming together about that. How it's going to happen in your lifetime and mine, it's not going to happen globally. It's going to be contextual, each and every context. So it's going to involve a price that each of us has to decide, where is our place in that? And where has God called you to be a part of it? So it's easy to be overwhelmed, but to take one piece and to say, okay, I'm going to be a part of it this way, I think is something that each individual can take on.
I think what I said just really complement that. I would on the topic of reparations, I would recommend the book by Olufemi Otaiwo, Reconsidering Reparations, because I think it's really important that we recognize, like Professor Denai was also saying, this isn't just something in the past, and sometimes that's sort of the implicit way that people frame this, like, oh, okay, so do we owe something for what happened in the past now or not? And just look at this city out the window where wealth is distributed. Look at the wealth that's in these Native American communities, and look at how wealth is distributed across the whole globe between countries that were colonizers or countries that were colonized. And this is just abundantly clear. We're still in this situation. So to me, almost before saying, oh, what should we do about something that happened a long time ago, I think we should just say, what are you responsible for what happened since you were born or since you turned 18? Maybe start with that, and when we get somewhere, we can start moving further back.
Any other questions? I have one. I'm still thinking. Thank you. I'm still formulating. Those of you who know me, I'm an external processor, but I'm thinking about the migrant crisis right now, and just hearing about what you're talking about, holistic, engagement, and then abundant and scarcity. I've been following it, and the sense is not enough. Can you just respond? Respond to that, how your approach and how you engage that?
Yeah, there's so many layers to that. I mean, we all know that in the last 10 years, we've lowered the quota of legal migrants from 200,000 to 20,000 and less. So the backlog is historic, and the millions that are waiting for their cases to be processed is an injustice that we need to deal with today. At the same time, we know that there are companies and farms and businesses that are dependent on that migrant labor. And there are several that are still coming and working without the just structures that need to be put in place. If there's an opportunity in your context, to vote on these things or to advocate for some of that kind of thing, we need to be involved in that and to hear about it and hear about the stories of the migrants, hear what's going on in their cases. Chicago's been the recipient of many of those migrants shipped here from Texas and other states. And I know that there's some political maneuvering going on right now to make sure that the city looks very needy, and we get more federal funding and all this kind of thing. That doesn't stop us though from doing the kind of work that people are doing. Even down along the border, where people are providing water and food and housing for those who can survive to come across. There's too many layers to really give an adequate answer to that, but I think to be aware of the situation, I think, is really critical. I don't know, Scott, you want to?
I don't really have anything to add about the detailed policies or whatever. I would maybe just say, try to think a little bit bigger, a little more comprehensively about these. Think about bigger solutions, more systemic solutions to issues like, why are people moving? Why are they moving to the places they're moving to? just try to think at a really big level about these questions. And that's, probably something we need to be addressing the issues on that level as well.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Okay, so I heard you all speak about imbalance. And so when I think about the immigrants and things like that, in terms of them coming from where they are to here. So what does it take away from where they are to come here? And what does it take away from America for them to come here as well? So I think about immigration, how charity begins at home, and at what point is too much.
Well, I don't think that agape love can ever be overexpressed if it's really agape. There is a charity that destroys dignity. And if you want to read When Helping Hurts, that kind of thing, there's books about that as well. As my brother here mentioned, there are historic reasons that cause displacement, which oftentimes our government has been a part of. The bananas that we get could have displaced many villagers in many parts of Central and South America because of different structures within major corporations. And the produce that we eat out of season in our own homes and areas is because we demand that, and that will be part of the structures that are unjust, that have caused displacement of peoples. I think we need to unpack some of those things. So there's a little resource that I want to recommend called the Better World Shopping Guide. The Better World Shopping Guide, which is online, and it grades by product different sources based on humanitarian and environmental concerns. And you can look up chocolate, you can look up gasoline, you can look up soap, you can look up all these different things, and it grades those, and it could cause you to do a little more discernment in your purchasing. Is there too much charity? I'm going to say never.
If I could just add one perspective, that is maybe something similar going on between where the migrant communities are being housed and sometimes the parts of the city that, again, if we look out here, who are being harmed most from industry pollution and things like that. And you have this situation where, from what I've heard on NPR, so you correct me if I'm wrong, where the most underserved communities are also the ones that are being asked to now make the sacrifices for another underserved community that is here now. And it's the same way, it was in the news recently. This, I think, relates back to the idea of climate colonialism. In Louisiana, they're implementing some new carbon capture technology. Well, where are they going to store the captured carbon? In, again, the most underserved communities before there's been adequate testing to make sure it's safe. So, and then it's sort of pitted it against each other, like, well, do those communities support, climate change or something? It's like, well, that's not fair, and there's lots of other neighborhoods around Chicago that aren't giving so sacrificially at all to address these problems. So again, I think you just have to take one step back and look at it from a bigger perspective, and it's hard to know what to do about this at an individual level, which is why a lot of people suggest talking about it is the first best thing you can do. Tell other people about it, and then start organizing and get a couple people together to try to do something about it and to try to get your voice heard, which makes sense to me as a good next step.
Yeah, I want to add to what Dr. Johnson's saying there, that too much strategy is happening without the input of those who would be supposed beneficiaries. As a missionary, I can't tell you how many mission meetings I've been in where we strategize about those people, and those people are not at the table. I've decided I'm not going to those meetings anymore. where are we getting our knowledge? Where are we getting our information? And how can we hear from those who are not even speaking our language? And they're in our neighborhood, right here. So that's going to take more effort, more expense, more inconvenience, more time. And we might throw money at things, but are we willing to build the relationship, to build in those communities that are right around us? And those stories are extremely powerful because they're real. There's life. That's what's happening.
I think it's a great point. If I could just jump into that too, is the people in the communities that are being most affected by, say, environmental issues are also probably the ones who have the solutions. If people are willing to just listen and support the action that's being suggested.
Paul, I really appreciated your comments on doing holistic mission and sort of working to serve people's sort of material needs as alongside, their spiritual needs. Not that we want to make that distinction in the first place, but I was just wondering if you could reflect on that sort of premise a little bit more, but specifically in response to Jesus's words in John 6, after the feeding, they all sort of come back and he says, "You've not come back because you've seen the signs or heard my teaching, but because you want more loaves." That's just what that sparked for me.
Yeah, in my paper, I talk about rice Christians and maybe toilet Christians. Well, what does that mean? I mean, Jesus had many, many people follow for food and for external reasons until the commitment part. And he actually talked about, you have to eat my body and my flesh. And then he lost a lot of people at that point. The following wasn't so popular. It wasn't that kind of thing was not what they wanted. I think that in the context there, Jesus is discipling the disciples in a way to say, yes, I am concerned about these things, but you see in the second half of Jesus' ministry that the miracles kind of drop off and the teaching takes a prominence. That the identity here is that, yes, this person has power over creation, over nature, over human needs, but there's another level that's even more important. I always think of it like the junior high mission trip that says, we're going to go to Disneyland and then we're going to go do some work over here in this community. Go to Disneyland first, and then you'll get the thing that will really change you, which will be this encounter. And Jesus takes his disciples on cross-cultural mission trips across the border into the Gentile plot over and over again. So if you think that Jesus doesn't reach out to Gentiles, you haven't read the Bible very well. Jesus moves to the hinterlands of Capernaum, which was where there was an immigration outpost of the nations, to be closer, to fulfill that prophecy that the people in darkness would see a great light. And all of this was part of that mission to reach out in a way that was more. So I think that this was at the initial phases of Jesus' teaching, John 6, and those early miracles, those early feedings. And I think it's significant too that from what we understand, 5 and 6, one was a Gentile context and one was a Jewish context. So there's feeding there in both. Wasn't favoritism either. I don't know if that addresses it enough. It'd be fun to do more study if we went chapter by chapter. But I think it's 9, isn't it, where Jesus does the unsanitary spitting and putting it in the eyes, right? Which we don't recommend for mission strategy, okay? That's the first person, though, who says, who worships the Lord, is that unnamed blind man who was healed. And that's all about sending. There's the verb sending is all over the Gospel of John, and in chapter 9 is that sanitary, that weird thing, I would never have, I don't recommend doing this, but it made a lot more sense when I saw in Thailand that holy people have holy bodily fluids. And I know that there are people today who go to holy men and women in Thailand to get spit on for healing. Sorry, Sandra. I don't recommend it. I'm just saying this is a worldview that says you have power in you, in who you are. Go ahead. Oh, I thought you were gonna.
Now, thank you for speaking about mission and, what it is that, we need to do. However, I feel like I work with the mission level. And we in churches is, need to be focused, be guided, that God leads us in a different kind of way. Because we are seeing so much happen. It's burning over here, flooding over here, and I mean, we have so many things going on around us, and things will come up. Again, we get involved ourselves in a war in another country, and the separatism is going on behind closed doors. We have a person that's trying to become our president that is a radical,
We know where you're going.
At one time, and we have to go tradition. We talk about spirit of God. We talk about the glory of God. We talk about what we did in that. But where is it that we begin to really start talking about?
Yeah, yeah. Great. I love it. Thank you, Sandra. The mission of God starts with God's question to us. Where are you? The mission field is not them out there. It's us right here. And I believe that the whole Bible is God's invitation. Will you be a part of what I want to have happen? That mission is the theme of God, of the Bible, and God's people need conversion every day. So in our covenant tradition, we talk about being mission friends. How goes your walk? How are you with the Lord? How is your walk today, right now? So we need to missionize each other every single day. That God's work is God's initiative, not the church's. Okay, church didn't start mission. God did. The mission has a church. The church doesn't own God's mission, to quote famous missiologists. So it's very overwhelming to see all the things that are out there. But I think the first question is, okay, Lord, what are you calling me to be today in your own life? And to be faithful to that. And it could be as simple as choosing what you're going to buy or not buy, or how you reflect on the relationships of the moment. That these are divine encounters with that person on the street, or that person on the L, or wherever they are coming from, and to know how you are going to be making the change. I'll just say one quick thing. A guy told me the other day that he was on the L a few years ago, the public transportation here, and sneezed, and somebody said,
actually, in about 15 minutes. So
I mean it.
not too bad. But you too.
And he never forgot
See you
that.
around.
So I think there's little ways that we could be culturally innovative with social norms that go beyond the cultural expectation. Say something.
I'll just say one final thought. I think education is really important. I think changing people's minds will go a long way in solving these big problems. One thing that I sort of thought about when I was teaching at Wheaton College a couple semesters ago is a prophetic voice, which I sort of defined as speaking truth with moral clarity. And you see this Friday for Futures movement just explode because Greta Thunberg she really would just go and speak truth to power. And I think it's a beautiful example just now of what you did is what we need to be doing. Just speak the truth. If it's true, say it. If it has moral significance, acknowledge it. And maybe that'll be a way to get by a little bit of the splitting everything 50-50 and just staying with the status quo.
That's a fine ending. Thank you.